Hi, this is Paul. We're about halfway through the Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pageau commentary. Sort of the way the stuff works for me is I listen to it once, maybe listen to it twice, and then I do a commentary, and you just sort of... part of me is still quite surprised I never watch these videos. But I profit tremendously from the comments, from the feedback through Discord, from the conversations I have with you. So I just keep doing this as long as it still seems productive in terms of the ends that I'm pursuing, which is learning more by talking about this content. Now, we're about halfway through this, and these comments of mine are sort of a first draft. But already, after doing comments on the first half of it, I get to the point of starting to get like little snippets of it, memorable moments in it where I sort of go back on it and I go back on deeper questions. Because, part of what happens as I talk to people about this stuff is, is Jordan going to become a Christian? And what would that mean? And so part of what I go over in my head are the categories that we're working on. And so then other new video ideas come to mind. But if I start making those videos, I won't finish this video. And I want to finish this video. I want to get all the way to the end. And then I can start taking little snippets of it and putting that together with some other things. So let's keep going.
You're either aiming at Christ or something lesser.
Yeah.
Or if things get really out of hand, you're aiming at something opposite, and you don't want to be doing that. But
he'd been making the point that he couldn't seem to convince Sam Harris of this. Well, many have tried to convince Sam Harris of a great number of things. One of the videos I want to make is how we colonize each other. Anyway.
And this is a matter of definition in some sense. And it's actually not impossible to understand, is that you aim at something better, generally speaking. I mean, maybe you're out to cause pain, but forget about that. You aim at something better.
Now this better, again, those of you who watch a lot of my content, you know that one of the things I try to figure out is, okay, how do we know the good? How do we navigate towards the good? And a big part of how we do this is better or worse. It's a little A/B testing. And I'm going to play some of a conversation between John Vervaeke and Sam from the Discord server, because they just had a conversation and I thought it was an outstanding conversation. I'm so interested in that conversation. And they get into this a little bit because part of the reason John Vervaeke is such a helpful conversation partner in this is partly because he isn't a Christian, at least not yet. But he's so smart and he knows so much theology and philosophy and cognitive science that he keeps us Christians honest. And he does it so gently and so respectfully, you can't help but love him. So that's John Vervaeke, and I really hope that the Thunder Bay Conference happens in September, perhaps. And that would be awesome because I've never met Jonathan Pageau or John Vervaeke in my life. And that's going to be a time when Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke and I meet in person. And hopefully I'll have my COVID shot by then and we can travel by air and we can do all these things that we haven't been able to do for a year. So looking forward to that. So, and sometimes people ask about what this is. This is my little mask. Okay. Because people come to the church and so on and so forth, and the whole mask thing is complicated socially and all those things, so it's just easy to have one on and just to do it. Anyway, back to this conversation. See, this is where I start getting beyond just the one through commentary thing. I start to dig down in certain issues that this conversation touches in, and one is, okay, how are we to think about Jordan Peterson? Is he a Christian? Is he not a Christian? And I have this conversation with a lot of people fairly regularly, and a lot of it boils down to the definition. Well, how do you define a Christian? If someone self-identifies as Christian, and of course Tom Holland completely throws this into the mix by making the statement that, well, we've all been so deeply impacted by Christianity, and on and on and on and on and on. So Jordan here is talking about the better, and sort of we go for the better, and well, let's let him say what he's going to say.
Wouldn't do it unless it was better. In fact, it virtually defines better. Like
Yeah.
the whole idea of better is predicated on the idea that there's an aim that's beyond you. And then the highest.
And okay, so there's an aim that's, and now pay attention to all the spatial metaphors that we're using to orient ourselves. All this exaptation, again, another fancy Vervaeke word that I learned from him. All this exaptation. So there's an aim that's higher from you, and of course the higher thing is what Jonathan Pageau tried to challenge Brett Weinstein on. There's an aim that's higher from us, and so we go better. And the idea is obviously that, well, how to work this a little bit more fat in the ice cream makes it taste better. Is fat better or worse? A little bit more money is better, but too much money can disorient us. And so we're always doing this dead reckoning, this little A-B testing to look for better, to look for better. And the assumption is that, in fact, there is such a thing as better. We're not moral nihilists in this. We're navigating and we're trying to go somewhere. We're trying to arrive someplace. And of course, Pageau has been talking about theosis in this conversation.
Of those aims is the highest aim is the amalgamation of all higher aims.
And so then if you start doing this, you begin to realize that, well, there's better in this way and better in that way and better in this way. And then the combination of those, of course, you've got combinatorial explosion also going on in this, but bit by bit by bit by bit, we can make our life better. Well, what's a better life? Well, that I'm able to pay my bills instead of getting instead of getting foreclosure notices, that I'm able to give better things to my children. Well, what does that mean? Maybe a car that runs instead of a car that breaks down, or to give them adequate clothing instead of inadequate clothing, or perhaps adequate clothing with style instead of just adequate clothing, and on and on and on and on and on. And then there's no end to this.
That's a perfect mode of being. And that by definition, that's a psychological perspective again. That by definition is Christ. But then there seems to be something too convenient.
Now, again, before we get to C.S. Lewis here, that by definition is Christ. Okay, that's the ideal. But many people will read the New Testament and say, well, I could imagine, getting not crucified is better than getting crucified. I like my heroes untortured rather than captured and tortured. And so you can see very quickly this thing gets very complicated.
About C.S. Lewis's insistence that also had to manifest itself concretely in reality at one point in history. And I'm not like
And okay, so if there's a better, Lewis basically says, and this is where the ontological argument for me is a really interesting thing, because on one hand, just because you can posit something doesn't mean it exists. And we all know that. I can posit a smarter me, a stronger me, a me who doesn't have all of the moral defects that I have, and maybe a me who didn't lose his hair. Because you don't realize what a wonderful thing hair is until you lose it. You have to wear a cap all the time, because otherwise the California sun just makes your head all crumbly and dry. And how do I know that? Because I've seen a lot of pasty-skinned white guys in California in their 70s and 80s, and their skin is just destroyed by the hot California sun. So maybe a better me doesn't live in California. Maybe a better me continues to live in the northern Frisian regions of the Netherlands, where 2-3 generations ago my ancestors came from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we say, okay, so Christ is at this point, and Lewis basically makes the point that, well, it's sort of an ontological argument that, well, what good is the story if it never instantiates? And in fact, this is a point that Lewis not only makes with respect to Christ, but Lewis keeps making with respect to us and our dreams and all of this better, that if it doesn't actually is too convenient a word, if it doesn't put us in a trajectory that leads to glory, if your desire for joy can never lead you to joy, if your desire for strength can never lead you to strength, if your desire for justice can never lead you to justice, then the desire is a gift you should probably turn back in. Read or listen to C.S. Lewis's Life in Atomic Age. Pageau's going to mention Gnosticism here, and so that's where I'm going to jump into Sam's video.
I don't understand why I should believe that.
Should there is a really interesting word too. Because should, in terms of a moral obligation that if there's a God that you're a little bit terrified of, he will hold you to account. Should in terms of, well, I should exercise more, but I don't. Because if I exercised more, I would be in better shape. Maybe I'd have a longer life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Should is a very funny word. It would be better that, and so Jordan's sort of, should I dare to dream that the universe is the kind of place where the truth of Christ is real? And this gets into these knotty questions of, should Jordan be a Christian? Well, how would we understand Christian? I was having a conversation with my drug dealer. And I call him my drug dealer, even though I don't buy drugs, and I've never bought any drugs from him. But he lives in the neighborhood, and he supplies drugs to a lot of the homeless people I know. And we've become friends over the years, and he'll often come into the parking lot when I get here in the morning, and he'll come out and he'll have a question for me. And this drug dealer, his father is a Christian, or his father is a pastor, and his sister is a pastor. And so, I was talking to my drug dealer this morning, and we were talking about Christians and evil and right and wrong. And very quickly, I shared with him my definition of who a Christian is. I said a Christian is someone who trusts Jesus more than they trust themselves. That's not the only definition of a Christian, but I find pastors are often looking for, I'd say they're like little pocket tools that we can have in our pocket when someone comes up to us and they have a question and they don't have 3 hours to listen to a video of me talking to try and define things. I need something that can do some work right here and right now. And that's what pastors look for. And so that's a little tool I keep in my pocket. A Christian is someone who trusts Jesus more than he or she trusts him or herself. And perhaps a Christian organization trusts Jesus more than they trust their power, et cetera, et cetera. So should Jordan believe this? It's a really complicated question because, well, should Jordan believe that he's going to have a life without the level of pain that he's had? You might say, well, if you don't believe that, you might not live. Should Jordan believe that his daughter will have a level of freedom from the illness that she has been suffering from? Yeah, because if she doesn't, she's not going to have hope. And so this is almost connected to Jordan's better, okay? Now, someone might come around, similar to the ontological argument, and say, well, maybe Jordan shouldn't believe this. Maybe this is a false hope. Maybe Jordan, for the rest of his life, is going to have to. I mean, when he talks about what he has to deal with just to function, and Pageau is right. I mean, for him to have written this book, well, he wrote it. I think he wrote some of it before, a lot of this, but to edit this book, and the book just came out today, and I just downloaded the audiobook, which I'm going to listen to. And I think about the fact that he recorded this audiobook in the midst of all this pain. I'm just dumbfounded by it. I can't even manage to write a book. If you want some insight into that, ask John Vervaeke and Christopher Mastropietro. But it very much gets to the question of Christianity, because the charge is often made that Christians have a false hope, and it's sort of like a false hanging on to the ontological argument. But that rings true of just about everything in this world. Those who died under Mao or Stalin or Hitler or Pol Pot or Idi Amin or Papa Doc and Baby Doc or Trujillo or any government you want. in a materialist frame, they have no hope. Well, maybe they have hope for a better reputation, but does that really do you any good from the grave? And so Lewis comes and basically says, if there is in fact an ideal, in a way, Lewis says, I like my ideals to have been instantiated. And I think a good materialist or a good pragmatist would want to embrace something like that. Because we know in this world that all symphonies remain unfinished, as Karl Rahner says. And so this place where Jordan kind of pauses here is an important one, and you can really argue it from both sides, because there's whole ranges of our life that, well, if I can't actually accomplish any of my goals, well, sure, there might be other goods that come along the way towards the goal. But if you just simply dismiss the goal out of hand, is it reasonable to pursue? So, yeah, let's let it go. And then Pageau's going to get into Gnosticism. I'm going to play some of Sam's.
And I tend not to believe things without a why. There's always a why. And there's a hurdle there that I waver on constantly, because I already said that when you think these things through, at least my experience has been, if you think them through sufficiently, you end up with the choice between impossible alternatives. And so
but it has to do, one of the ways to see it maybe is it has to do with the recognizing of the goodness of the world, or the goodness of creation.
That is foundational right there. And we're going to, let's let Jonathan play, and then I want to play Sam and John Vervaeke's conversation, or at least a little bit of it.
That the world is capable of manifesting these patterns, right? So if you want to understand, for example, the big conflict between the early Gnostics and the Christians, that's what it was all about. Because the Gnostics basically wanted a disincarnated Christ. They were saying, and they viewed the world as utterly fallen, as having no value, having to be escaped, having to be fled in every way. Whereas Christianity posits that it's a non-dual proposition. It's saying it all comes together. That's the promise. It all comes together. And so it has to come down, right? And so it has to come down at every level. And not only that it has to come down into the person of Christ who's incarnated, but that person has to go down into death, to the very bottom of the world, to the belly of the Leviathan, and then come back up. And so the whole world is declared as, once again, being capable of participating in this good. And so you could say, well, maybe it wasn't that one. Maybe it wasn't, it's like, why would it be that particular place where it happened? And
it had to be some place.
That's the story. I mean, there is no other story like that story that we have. And so once you recognize that this is part of the declaration that the world does embody these patterns, that it leads to this, it leads to this story of a man who embodied them absolutely, and is bringing us in him to also embody them in a way that will transform us. Like the ultimate goal of Orthodox vision of Christianity is theosis. It's to become God, through transformation and participation in God. So that's the final goal of everything, is to become participant in the divine.
And now I talked about theosis in the last video, but I do want to go back. I do want to go to Sam's video, because Sam made this point to me, and when he said it, it was about Brett Weinstein and his repeated take on evolution. And when he said it, I saw it immediately, and I thought, oh, that's genius, Sam. But Sam says a lot better than I do, which is, that's just the way these things work. So Sam has been on my channel, and some of you know Sam because he grew up an evangelical non-Trinitarian, which I didn't know any of them existed, but there he was. And, when he kind of came into the realm of my channel, I had all these Christians who were at least the ones who liked me could tolerate atheists and could be very welcome and alluring because, of course, we have our traps for them. And then along comes Sam, and he denies the Trinity, and it's like, hackles. But Sam had a terrific conversation with Brett Sockold about a whole number of issues, and Sam is super smart, and he's very articulate, and he's got a day job, so we'll just leave it at Sam. But he's been running his own little YouTube channel, and again, some of these YouTube channels that have started since I've done mine, of the people around me, Mary and Karen, and I feel like a mama bear, so proud of these channels. I love the randos. I love these guys in these channels. And this is where Sam really lays down the argument to John Vervaeke. And it gets into, I think, so when Peterson is sort of stuck here, I think part of the reason he's stuck here is sort of this implicit Gnosticism in this very common view of evolution right now.
I saw a debate discussion between Richard Dawkins and Brett Weinstein one time. Back before COVID. They were in Chicago, and I'm in Chicago, so I went and saw that. And I think that if Christianity and Neoplatonism are close siblings, there's a third sibling in the family of Gnosticism that is also interconnected with it.
Oh, totally.
And it's sort of the estranged sibling in many ways. But if I could, like Gnosticism would often say that somehow something wrong in the cascade of being happened, right? Either there was a malevolent God, right? Subordinate to the main God, or some God acted in ignorance, or either badness or ignorance, or some combination of those things led to where we are now, right? Whereas a Neoplatonist would say, no, it's a cascade of goodness, right? Maybe there are degrees of goodness, but there's not a bad step somewhere in the process. And Christianity is actually interesting in that it says, well, the creation process was good, but there's badness in the creation now.
Yeah.
Right?
It tries to split the difference. Yeah.
Right. So there is badness, but it wasn't in the cascade or that caused us to come into being. It was sort of after that. Right. And so what I think is interesting, connecting that idea to Brett Weinstein and a lot of sort of like Sam Harris, I think will say these sorts of things that basically evolution is sort of like this malevolent force in their imagination that Brett Weinstein will say evolution is a cosmic spelling bee that ends in genocide or something like that. That we need to transcend our programming to escape it, as if it had.
And this, of course, is a point that I keep making when I listen to these guys, like, okay, so I'm going to wake up one morning and my Android phone is running iOS? No.
Has this meta purpose to it that is somehow we can recognize as evil from where we're standing now. And I think that it's strangely Gnostic in that kind of way.
Totally.
And
I think that's brilliant what you're saying. Brilliant.
Mm-hmm. And it's sort of like we need to transcend our programming. Okay, so how are we doing that? Like the Gnostics at least said, we can hopscotch the bad God to get back to the good God, right?
Right.
We were made by a bad God, but perhaps our soul or our mind or something is good, and we need to, jump back up the ladder to the good rungs and escape the bad rungs. But without anything like that, I don't understand how sort of the kind of pretty strictly materialistic evolution is a malevolent force that has there's something in it that desires badness. It desires genocide. It desires death. It desires competition. It desires, conquering of the fittest and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and Stanovich does something within cognitive psychology very similar. He talks about the robot's rebellion. He's very influenced by Dennett's idea of means, and Dawkins' selfish gene. But what I can say again is biology, cutting edge biology, philosophy of biology is really abandoning those models to a very significant degree. I agree with you. And it sort of reminds me of Jung's idea that the default spirituality of human beings is Gnosticism. because it's a way of
and I had never known that. I don't know anywhere near enough Jung to really I always call him Jung. I don't know. To it's that whole Dutch throat thing. But I found this idea from Vervaeke very interesting.
Projecting a narratuality of human beings is Gnosticism, because it's a way of projecting a narrative that redeems you from your insignificance and your powerlessness. It gives you a central role. And I have a very ambivalent attitude towards Gnosticism, because I think I agree with Hans Jonas. The Gnostics are sort of like proto-existentialists. They're talking about how we often find ourselves caught in sort of existential ignorance and existential inertia. We're stuck. That's a common thing people say when they go into therapy. We're stuck and we don't know how to get unstuck, and we don't know who we really are. And so we seek gnosis. We seek the kind of knowing, deeply participating in ourselves that will heal us from our existential inertia, our existential ignorance. So I'm very interested in gnosis, and I'm interested in the Gnostics because they were creating this mythos that were trying to give expression to that. But
and just to interrupt my friend here, it's also interesting because in Christianity, of course, we're looking for participation in Christ, and it's participation in Christ that actually draws us out of ourself, and it's through Christ that we begin to transcend. And it's if you want to listen to someone talk about agape, I can't find anything on the internet as good as what John Vervaeke did in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, where he sets up agape, and it's via agape that Christ pulls us into him. And I love the way John Vervaeke talked about how it's agape that's the agape of the mother, the self-donating love that raises that child into her and into adulthood and into the family. And in many ways, Christ does this to us, and he does it through narrative, he does it through story, the big conversation that Vervaeke and Pageau and I and some others are having in his channel is this whole debate over telos and over narrative, and this conversation he had with Sam was very much a part of that.
But I'm also very critical of them because they're sort of like you said, it's a pervasive temptation of human thought that puts us into what Jules Evans calls conspirituality. There's a grand conspiracy, right? And spirituality is a response to the grand conspiracy. And so I really appreciate what you just said. I thought that was really beautiful. And first of all, it shows how people like Weinstein and others are deeply, deeply spiritual and even mythopoetic without realizing it. So congratulations on that. I think that's a very well said thing. I'm gonna keep that. I've made similar.
Yeah, he's gonna keep it. I'm gonna keep it. A lot of us are gonna keep it. That idea that Sam had is a keeper. Okay, so back to Jordan and Jonathan. In the videos where I'm wrestling with this question of history and where I'm dealing with the history of fundamentalism in American culture, and when I think about where the lines really lie between belief and unbelief currently in our culture, and part of why I'm fascinated by Jordan is that he's just not only has he organized himself right on this line in terms of the culture that has put him right there in Thor's in Thor's trap, but he's got himself right there on so many of these lines, and so in just chatting with how many people online, and the Christians of course tend to be well, why won't Jordan cross the line? And I think, okay, what exactly is that line? And certainly we know the outward manifestations of that line. If Jordan was raised in a United Church of Canada, he might very well have been baptized as an infant. I don't know. But, baptism. And so Jordan starts going to church, and God help his priest or pastor. Well, you have quite a project on your hands. Not the easiest parishioner, I would imagine. I shouldn't laugh too hard. But I wrangle a lot of tough characters. Jordan's just smarter than most and argues better than most. So yeah, to be his pastor, not an easy challenge. But let's keep going.
How do you distinguish that from Catholicism?
No, I mean, in terms of that, I think that it's a difference of emphasis. I think for sure the Orthodox emphasize theosis more than the Catholics. The Catholics are kind of iffy about theosis in terms of it's there in some of the thinkers, but I would say it's probably not official Catholic doctrine.
Now this has been debated now in my YouTube comment section quite a bit, a debate that no one will win. And I think in some ways the question, so Jonathan uses theosis here, which is what has been a mainstay, at least from what I've seen in terms of the Orthodox world. It gets into this question of, okay, what exactly do we mean by this word salvation? And I would say most traditions assume definitely some participation in Christ. It's just Pauline. Okay, well, how are we to talk around that? What are the images? And now my friend Sam, the non-Trinitarian, I know some people they don't have a lot of patience with Sam because he's not a Trinitarian. But I have a lot of patience with Sam, and some people say, well, you have a lot of patience with everybody. Well, okay, almost everybody. And you seem to like it when I lose my patience with some. Anyway, which maybe isn't helping me. But part of the reason I like Sam around is he challenges me. Not that I'm defecting from my subscription to the Trinity, but he challenges me on, okay, so Jesus is God. What do you mean by that sentence? What do you mean by this word God? And so, it's easy to sort of whip out a word like theosis, and I just talked about how I just whip out a Christian is someone who trusts Jesus more than they trust themselves. Pastors need these little things these little cards to play in conversations with people, because you just usually get a moment to. In fact, I also was thinking about this too. So we have these conversations. What are these conversations? Conversations are in the hope of relationship. What are relationships in the hope of? Relationships are in the hope of communion. And so our relationship with Christ is in the hope of communion, in the hope of participation, in the hope of transformation. When Peter sees Jesus walking on the water, it was Peter who says, bid me come, Lord. And Peter gets out of the boat and starts walking on water, but then, of course, famously looks at the waves and starts to sink. And Jesus takes him by the hand and says, okay, toddler, you go back in the boat. But this participation, James and John, their mother, come to Jesus and say, well, when your regime, Jesus is supposed to lead a mob and storm the Capitol and, take over Jerusalem and kick out the Romans. That's what John's mom is looking for. And she's hoping that James and John get to be, head revolutionaries, lieutenants in Jesus' grand revolt. And so let them sit at your right and left hand. Jesus looks at him and says, are they able to drink from my cup? Well, what cup is that? And so this is where, in the last video, that really got me thinking about, okay, well, what are we asking for? And what is Jordan asking for? So on one hand, we're asking for, well, participation. Bid me, Lord, to come to you and walk on water. I want to walk on water. I want to be able to still the storm. I want to be able to raise the dead. There have been many times when, as a pastor, I sit down with someone and their addiction or their mental illness or the addictions or mental illness of a loved one, a parent or a child, and I want to lay hands on the afflicted and release them from their pain. But that gift has not been given to me, and maybe because I don't have the faith, maybe because I don't have the discipline, maybe because I don't want it bad enough. But this question of participation, and one of the early things I wrote on my blog was a bit about hell. I've just triggered a whole debate right in the Discord section again. If there's participation, then there's non-participation. And I want to participate, or how badly do I want it? And so, Jordan, I don't have, I totally understand where he's at. I think many of us do. Do you really want to drink from the cup that Jesus has to drink from? And in some ways, he goes first. And in many ways, he does it instead of us. So what really do we want?
But I think without theosis, you're missing the point of the whole thing. Right? You're missing the point of everything. Like, why do things exist? Right? Like, why do things exist? And so I think that the idea that they exist to participate fully in their most perfect form, like that's what they're called to do, and it ends up being a declaration of the ultimate possibility for goodness in the world. I think.
What does Jordan want for his daughter? What does any parent want any good parent want for their child? They want strength, and they want beauty, and they want courage, and they want, all of this virtue, all of this good. And of course, in this world, we might get inklings and glimpses of it, but then we see the loss and catastrophe.
I think that's, yeah.
Well, it seemed to me, I've observed, let's say, that it's possible to it isn't obvious to me that anyone wants to live a meaningless existence. I don't think you can live a meaningless existence without becoming corrupted, because the pain of existence will corrupt you without a saving meaning. And it also seems to me...
This is, again, why I say for Jordan, meaning is a sacrament.
That you can sell the story that meaning is to be found in responsibility. When I've tried to sell that story to myself, I seem to buy it. And when I've tried to communicate it with other people, it renders them silent. Large crowds of people silent. And that's strange, because I'm not sure why that is. It's perhaps because the connection between responsibility and meaning had never been made in that explicitly somehow.
One of the really interesting things is that there's been a lot of people out there talking about meaning and responsibility for a long time, and it's been in the church for a long time. And so it isn't just that, well, you just use those words, meaning and responsibility. Before Jordan came on the scene, it was pretty common parlance in certain corners of the world, and certainly in certain churches. Jordan did it in a different way.
Because meaning gets contaminated with happiness or something like that, but it's to be found in responsibility. And then you could say, well, there isn't any responsibility that's more compelling than trying to aid things in the manifestation of their divine form. That should be an adventure that could be sold. And I don't know why the church can't do it.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm trying to think if I've ever heard a pastor articulate it in the way that Jordan just did there. So I thought about, there were some rumblings around my sermon last Sunday. Some people didn't hear me correctly on some things or projected some things onto the sermon, and mostly don't get rumblings. And I thought about the fact that I know how to preach safe sermons. And I don't want to, for the meaning issue. And even though it's quite clear in this video that Jonathan and Jordan are talking about Christ and Christianity, and Jordan turned a whole generation on to something, it's very difficult to figure out exactly. I started my whole channel because I watched Jordan doing something. I thought, okay, bid me, Jordan, upon the YouTube waters. And, well, he didn't bid me. I went out anyway. But yeah, Jordan's got a point, but it's not just responsibility either. There's a lot more going on, a lot more to it.
I don't understand that, and because it seems to me that that's something that I've done, at least in part.
And also, but he sort of bid people out into the meaning. And when John Vervaeke said meaning crisis, it was like, yeah, that's right. Jordan should have used those words. But part of the reason I got going here was Jordan didn't have, and I've often used the illustration of the Billy Graham crusade. Before the Billy Graham crusade would come into town, they would meet with all the churches because they knew that there needed to be follow-up and people needed structure and people needed to follow up with things. And Jordan's done a remarkable job as a crusader along these lines. But he didn't build much of anything for the people around them to help people get into small groups. And this is why I started making meetups and working with the people who in my meetup to have the Discord server. And this is why I do question and answers on the Discord server and not just on YouTube. And this is why I do all of these things. I'm a pastor. I gather sheep, and I look for sheepdogs who can gather sheep and get them in a fold and help them thrive and multiply and do what sheep need to do, and every now and then you got to wrangle a lion or a bear or something. But that's what pastors do. And so, yeah, you can gather people, but you really need to also figure out how to help them do what people do, which is develop institutions and develop platforms and develop spaces and help those sheep not get parasites and protect them from wolves and bears and lions. And that's all that needs to happen. And I'm not in any way getting defensive for the sake of the church. I've got, like I've said before, I've got my long list of things from the church. And so that's why when I saw Jordan doing this, I thought, okay, churches, let's, a new, very different Billy Graham has gotten to town, and he doesn't have an organization around him, so let's get busy.
And that accounts for the strange popularity of the biblical lectures in particular.
Yeah.
But I've also, and I do believe that. I do believe that the right striving is to attempt with all your heart to encourage things to develop along that, towards that divine goal. Like, what else would you possibly do? Once you think that through, it's like you're always aiming at something that's better, or you wouldn't be aiming. You're always moving towards something that's better, or you wouldn't be moving. So then why wouldn't you move towards the greatest good?
Yeah.
Well, it's because it's terrifying, I suppose, in part.
Again, it's sort of the ontological argument.
But then I've tried to put that into practice in my life, and it's tearing me into pieces.
Yeah.
Well, it's Thor, and of course it's tearing you to pieces. Jonathan's about to say.
I don't know, though, if one of the reasons is because you're also alone. And because at least to my understanding, you're not in a community.
Well, it's hard to say. It's hard to say.
Because fans aren't a community.
Well, they've been a community.
Yeah.
One of the things that has held me together certainly is the commitment that I feel to the people who've been so positive towards me and my family. I do feel that as a community. I understand what you mean. Why the hell not go to church? I know you're
wasn't going to come right out and say it, Jordan.
Yeah.
It's not just going to church. And so, again, I've done a lot of thinking, too, about institutionally about this. And my videos on the civil rights movement sort of there was an institutional pivot that happened, and there's been a lot of these institutional pivots. I mean, Netflix and the movie industry and radio. I mean, a lot of this has moved sort of church functions out, and the government has in some ways replaced whole sections of the church, sort of reversing what happens with the decline of the Roman Empire. And so there's a lot going here. And so even this phrase, okay, going to church, well, what do you mean? And Jonathan's going to spell it out a little bit more.
I know you're not that blunt about it.
But it's not just, it's not just about going to church. One time I told you something, and I don't know if I was able to drive it through. There's something about being in a hierarchy because there's an aspect of being in a hierarchy that you talk about, which is this kind of striving to kind of be the best within that hierarchy. But there's an aspect of being in a hierarchy, which is that the hierarchy covers you.
Oh, definitely. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. And so there's something about submitting. That's
why the lowest status members of a chimp group will still fight off interlopers.
Yeah. And so there's a value in being in a community and a hierarchy where you, like, I go to confession, right? I go to confession. I go to my priest and I confess my sins, and I give that to him. He actually takes responsibility for an aspect of listening to my sins and kind of participating in my salvation. And so the weight ends up being distributed across the community. It's not, so you don't actually just bear it on yourself. And it's not just it's not just a living community. It's not just those that are alive in the hierarchy, but those that have left their story. All the saints are part of this hierarchy that you engage in, that you participate in, and that you see as consolation, as examples, as examples of people who have lived through difficult things that you can kind of that you can shoulder up against, And so
I can't listen to this discussion and not think of chapter 2 in C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters. My dear Wormwood, I note with grave displeasure that your patient has become a Christian. Do not indulge the hope that you will escape the usual penalties. Indeed, in your best moments, I trust you would hardly ever wish to do so. In the meantime, we must make the best of the situation. There is no need to despair. Hundreds of these adult converts have been reclaimed after a brief sojourn in the enemy's camp and are now with us. All the habits of the patient, both mental and bodily, are still in our favor. One of our great allies at present is the church itself. Do not misunderstand me. I do not mean the church as we see her, spread out through all time and space and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners. That, I confess, is a spectacle which makes our boldest tempters uneasy. And that, of course, is what Pageau was talking about. But fortunately, it is quite invisible to these humans. All your patient sees is the half-finished sham Gothic erection on the new building estate. When he goes, he sees the local grocer with a rather oily expression on his face bustling up to offer him one shiny little book containing a liturgy which neither of them understands, and one shabby little book contains corrupt texts of a number of religious lyrics, mostly bad and in very small print. When he gets to his pew and looks around, he sees just that selection of his neighbors whom he has hitherto avoided. You want to lean pretty heavily on those neighbors. Make his mind flit to and from between an expression like the body of Christ and the actual faces in the next pew. It matters very little, of course, what kind of people that next pew really contains. You may know one of them to be a great warrior in the enemy's side. No matter. Your patient, thanks to our Father below, is a fool, provided that any of these neighbors sing out of tune, or have boots that squeak, or double chins, or odd clothing. The patient will quite easily believe that their religion must therefore be somehow ridiculous. At his present stage, you see, he has an idea of Christians in his mind, which he supposes to be spiritual, but which, in fact, is largely pictorial. His mind is full of togas and sandals and armor and bare legs, and the mere fact that the other people in church wear modern clothes is a real, though of course unconscious, difficulty to him. Never let it come to the surface. Never let him ask what he expects them to look like. Keep everything hazy in his mind now, and you will have all eternity wherein to amuse yourself by producing in him the peculiar kind of clarity which hell affords. I love that image of Lewis, an army terrible, a terrible army with banners, an army terrible with banners. Exactly how he did it, but that's what Pageau is bringing out.
So that's one of the reasons why I kind of insist with, at least for the people that watch my videos, is when I say go to church, it's not just because I'm trying to moralize you into doing something. It's because it's actually a participation in how the best vision of reality works.
I've got no objection to any of that.
But I've seen you.
Objection.
I'm probably one of the only people in the world that has actually seen you in church and seen you,
and how that
squirm squirm in church.
Why?
And I think, okay, what kind of church would be helpful to Jordan? Oh gosh. Pray for whatever pastor or priest has to wrangle Jordan.
See, the other thing, I was reading this book, and it's mostly a jumping off place for me to think. It's like, there's also something, because I'm not inside the church, so to speak, it's hard to say what the utility of that is.
The utility of being inside the church.
Of being outside it.
Oh,
because I'm an outsider talking about religious matters.
Yeah, but I think
well, I know why, at least for me, why I have fantasies about being outside the church sometimes, because then I get to do what I want. Then I get to see. So if the idea is that we project up onto the sky our idea of God, which of course isn't a dumb idea, except Lewis, of course, comes back and says, well, if that was all there is, what kind of a God would we be looking at? And in fact, you can find many people who are like that. Certainly not a God who judges you at all, or makes requests of you or demands of you. That's not the God Jordan Peterson is fearing, of course. But outside the church, outside of subscription to the dogmas of the faith, the dogmas, I get to be God. And on one hand, I think, oh, what a delightful prospect. But I'm a poor God. Anybody who would have me as a God is a fool. And so if I would have me as a God, I'm a fool. And anyone who finally comes to terms with their own limitations, their own fallibility, that their own propensity for continuously missing the mark, should be looking for a better God. And if in fact that God somehow revealed himself in this world, and if in fact that God somehow is associated with a group of people or a tradition or a book or an institution or any of that, one who is not a fool should bind himself to that people and that book and that tradition and that organization, even though it be not that vision of the army as Wormwood and Screwtape see it, but the vision that we see today. Because yeah, it's easy for me to look down on, I remember the things that you remember. I was sitting with my father. This was before I was a preacher, but I was in seminary or something, and I was sitting with my father, and we were talking about something. I think we were in a church or something, visiting a church, and I had made a rather immature comment about, well, if I had a church, it would be successful. My father just looks at me like, oh, really? Because my father, like me, was dramatically unsuccessful for his career. He pastored a little church in Paterson. Bingo, or drinking game. Pastored that little church in Paterson that never grew very big, and then another church in Baldwinsville, New York, never grew very big. And so, in this church, in this world of market-driven churches, Nothing makes you the ugly preacher like a small church.
I think that it has played a great role. Like I've often said that you're something like King Cyrus. If you know the story of King Cyrus, in scripture, King Cyrus was a Persian king who told the Jews to go back to Israel and build their temple. So he wasn't Jewish, like he wasn't an Israelite. He wouldn't believe in the God of the Israelites, but he was like, hey, that temple of yours looks pretty nice. Why don't you just go back there and rebuild your own thing? And
I love how he said that. That temple of yours looks pretty nice. You mean the one in ruins?
So that's definitely an effect that I've seen you have. The number of people that have become Christian.
No, he's the unauthorized exorcist. Jonathan's illustration is very interesting, though.
Because of you is hilarious. Sorry, it's not hilarious, but it's just kind of this strange thing, because you kind of stand outside and you're looking at the door and you're looking at the church and you're saying, hey, this isn't not so bad. Look at this. What is going on here? Like, what is this about? And then because of that,
well, it's also, do you think you've got something better? I was talking to a friend of mine the other day when we were walking, because as I said, I walk about 10 miles a day right now, try to keep myself under control. And he was raised a communist in Poland and then an atheist, and he was complaining. I think this is what he told me, that he was complaining to his parents at one point about a religious wedding that they were going to, despite not believing. And he said as he got older, he realized he had nothing to replace that with. It's like, okay, throw it out. Fine. Okay, now where are you? Well, you're just as bad off as you were before, but you also don't have that beautiful thing. Yeah. It's like, what would happen if we dispensed with Christmas? Well, if it's logical, it's a good thing to ask Sam Harris and the New Atheists. It's like, let's get rid of Christmas. Or we could say we could make it entirely secular, but then it would just disappear.
But that's not what's going to happen, because religion is inevitable, and we're seeing it coming back in very strange ways. It's going to be a weird, woke, identitarian religion, which is going to come back. That's why.
And primitive, part of it's going to be
tribalist.
Intent doesn't.
I don't think wokeness wins. I don't think it's reached its apex yet, but I don't think it wins. It's parasitic. It will. I don't think it wins. Just like it never fully wins, but that doesn't mean it won't be a bumpy, if not bloody ride.
Matter.
Yeah.
Can you believe that?
Yeah. So it's a scary thing. Like, that's what you could say, that's one of the failures of the New Atheists, is that they partly led to the new woke phenomena, because they didn't realize that you can't get rid of religion. You can't get rid of rituals. You can't get rid of the problems and opportunities of identity. All of these things are going to come back. If you try to brush them aside, then they're going to come back in very weird ways. And without you realizing what's going on, you'll have people kneeling to a shrine of a man who was killed by police and putting a halo on his head and self-mortifying themselves and doing all kinds of insane things, or that look to you insane, but that you need to understand it's just this religious impulse gone off the rails. So
yes, and then the question is, what's the right place for it?
That's right.
I've thought I suppose it's a form of comedy, that Catholicism is as sane as people get. It's Baroque, right? And it's Gothic, not Baroque. It's Gothic. It's dark. It has the same aesthetic in some sense as a horror film. And I'm not saying something denigrating by that. It's
well, and what he's saying is really actually quite important.
Part of its strange mystery. And all that strangeness is necessary, because people would be much more insane without it than they are with it. It's a container for that religious impulse, and that impulse is to the good.
Yeah, and the image of the crucified Christ, and also the act of communion, gathers in all the extremes together, right? It's like if you think of the symbolism of communion, you'll notice that it gathers in every extreme from the highest to the most transgressive. All of it comes together.
It's worth unpacking that. It's ritual cannibalism in the service of God.
Yeah.
You know, part of what, when I listen to Jordan get on this and Jonathan, you know, why am I a Protestant? I can't help it. These church traditions develop and amazingly are potent even as they, you know, the conversation I had with Kel Zeldin and Brett Sockold about Vatican II. You know, as a Protestant, I think long and hard about, okay, Lord, what church do you need next? Now, that's a very Protestant thing because, in a sense, the Orthodox, Nathan Jacobs, we don't need a next church. We already have one. Just go back to the one you have. And the Roman Catholics, but Jordan quite rightly, okay, but the Roman Church, that's the Latin Church, that's the Gothic Church, and of course the Protestants and all of, you know, one of my conversation with Jonathan Pageau, when I saw the aerial acrobats, I checked out. So I, you know, as a pastor, so this institution of the church is where my mind wanders, and I say, okay, Lord, what do you need from your church now? What do you need from your church now? You know, a church that can enfold and help Jordan and those who have responded to his call. And I don't know. And it, you know, clearly many have gone Orthodox. Will they stay there? How will they change the Orthodox Church? I don't know those questions, but I do know they need something.
Yeah, but it's also seen as a normal like meal of communion, and it's then also seen as a sexual union because there's a relationship, there's a notion in which then in the altar and in that moment of communion, there's the joining of heaven and earth. You know, they raise up the chalice and there's this joining, which is this image of this sexual union between God and the soul, between God and his church. And so all of it just jammed into this ritual as a kind of center of reality, would call it. And so, like you said, if you get rid of that, then you're going to have all kinds of strange, factitious versions of it that are going to pop up and are going to try to replace it. And it's leading to the fragmentation of our world and to the breakdown of the West, for sure.
So back to this idea of the mythological level and the historical level conjoining. I thought of that as convenient. You know, that's a stumbling point for me in relationship to the Christian story. It's, you say, it has to be like this if the world is constituted in a good manner. And it's the has to be. I mean, is that... So
how about if it's constituted?
Just let me say one. Just let me say this one thing, because I've been struggling towards it. This whole, it's an act of faith, and so let's say that your faith is that you decide to make the notion that reality is good the cornerstone of your faith. It's something that you believe, or is it something that you courageously assume? And is there a difference between that and belief? And if you
courageously assume, that was the words that I wanted him. Courageously assume. I think that's a really good idea. Okay, what is faith? It's a courageous assumption upon which you act.
You courageously assume. And is there a difference between that and belief? And if you courageously assume that the world is good, that reality is good, then the touching of the narrative and the objective in this manner that's demonstrated by Christ, that becomes necessary. Is that the idea?
So to me, it's funny. I don't see it as an act of faith in the way that we think of an act of faith, like this jump of faith or whatever. I see it as an act of trust, faith as trust, you would say.
That's fine. That would be a courageous assumption if it's trust.
And it's trust in the sense also of, so when we talk about the good, we always have to be careful not to just limit it to the good, to the moral good. There is the moral good. But when we talk about the good, we're talking about the good in a much larger way. And the good is the pattern of the things, right? And the sense that the fact that the world...
Tolkien's elves, the magic of the elves is... The magic of the elves in Tolkien, unlike the magic of Sauron or of Morgoth. I've been watching Nerd of the Rings lately. What a great channel. What a great channel. I love it. The power of the elves is that their rope is more ropey. It's stronger. The knots hold and loosen. The clothes, the bread nourishes better. The capes and the garments protect better and conceal better. Everything pursues its telos better. That's the magic of the elves. The magic of Morgoth and the magic of Sauron is a twisting away from the better, away from what it's made for, into service of a rebellious will.
Lays its right, and this is the pattern of the things, right? And the sense that the fact that the world lays itself out as ordered, as pattern, inevitably, that there is no way around it. You cannot avoid the order of the world because in order for you to even perceive anything, it has to have an identity, it has to have a hierarchy, has to have a margin, has to have all these things. It's all there in every
act of perception.
Exactly. And so in every act of perception. And so it's that.
So every act of perception presumes a value hierarchy.
Exactly. You can't avoid it. And so it's not like an act of faith in the sense that I at the outset think the world is nihilistic and chaotic. It's like, no, I don't. I think that, on the contrary, I think that you could say it in a religious way, that the love of God holds the world together, and it's inevitable that things are held together by these patterns of being that are always aiming towards the good, even in the very identity of whatever it is that you're encountering.
Let me ask you something personal then. I mean, you weren't born an Orthodox Christian. This is something you came to. How?
Well, I think that it has something to do with what you said before. It does have something to do with the sense that Christianity had fallen away from its original story and its original all-encompassing, let's say, cosmic narrative. And so it was really, I would say, in searching for that and kind of discovering symbolic thinking on other fronts and feeling like I was confronted by this, like, okay, so I can see these patterns. I can see the world through this coherence. And it's like, why is it then that Christianity doesn't have this? And then after more looking and more searching, I realized that it did. That not only it did, but that some of the most, powerful early saints talked about the world exactly this way, and so when I discovered that, then I looked around and I saw, for example, that iconography, that the relationship between icons and architecture and liturgy and all of this was like this amazing giant pattern which was reinforcing, manifesting, making you participate in the way the world actually existed.
Now it's interesting because in that way, Pageau and Peterson are sort of pairs, but it's helpful to remember that Pageau is the son of a deeply committed Christian. And so Jonathan is not a rebellious sort. And Jonathan's brother is not rebellious, and so Jonathan and his brother went after and discovered, they had their own map of meaning, but in a in a different way. Where's the Pageau book? It's here somewhere. Oh, here it is. So Jordan went maps of meaning, and the Pageau brothers went symbolism of creation, or the language of creation. And of course, this gets into the Marsden book, American or Fundamentalism and American Culture. This gets into the trajectories of these. And, Pageau had talked about the fact that for all of the failures of all of the reasons he left his evangelical upbringing, some of the things that benefited him were, of course, that delivered the Bible to him. So the Bible stories got inside of him, and that helped him with the orientation. And so it's interesting where he and Jordan sort of come together, but Jordan's United Church of Canada mainline upbringing didn't hold him. And Jonathan's did. And Jonathan managed to find, yet within the Christian tent, that which he was looking for. And so in that way, it's a little easier on Jonathan than it is on Jordan. I mentioned in my last video, and some of you, so I know some of you out there have roots in the same tradition I have, the Frisian mothers. So my one friend he's passed away now, who came to this church and was in AA for 25 years. Part of the reason he came to the Christian Reformed Church is he went in there and he said, those children are so well behaved in church. They sit still. They don't go out and leave for the sermon. They sit and listen to the whole sermon. He says, yeah, because we're in fear of death from our Frisian mothers. But the fundamentalist church, for all of its shortcomings, held people at least and continued to maintain a degree of discipline that afforded them, not all, of course, because we've had John Vervaeke in this video, and he's been more and more free to tell his story, and he tells it in a very respectful way. And maybe at some point John and I should talk about the unforgivable sin and how that has played, because it's a very common thing. And for many people that I meet, what I wish they had were better pastors. So it's very interesting how Jonathan found this, but he didn't have to go too far.
So it was like this kind of self, this positive feedback loop, I guess you could say it in a good way, where it's like you recognize these patterns, you engage in them, you see them, you sing them. It's like this whole thing where you're engaged. And so I realized that it was really in the Orthodox Church that this was that had been the most preserved and the most alive, and that I would hear, contemporary Orthodox speakers or thinkers or theologians who talked about the world exactly in that way. And so I thought, okay, so this is the place. And also because they kept the idea of theosis as the ultimate goal. Because I think that's, very, very early, St. Irenaeus, which is, like early 3rd century, said the Logos became man so that man would become God. That's some of the earliest saints said that, And so it's like, that's really what Christianity is. And so that's what ultimately led me to
well, it is the greatest of all possible visions.
Yeah. And so, but I think,
again, sort of the ontological argument again there.
I think that it's there latent, even in other forms of Christianity. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is help people kind of wake up to that reality and try to see it wherever they are.
And how's that going for you? Well, no, I'm really serious. I haven't talked to you for a long time. I mean, you've got this. I mean, you've had a strange few years as well.
I've had a strange few years as well. It's all your fault, by the way.
Yeah. It certainly feels.
A lot of us have Jordan to blame.
Feels that way.
And to credit.
But it's a good in that sense. I mean, I've been surprised in the past 4 years since I met you and you kind of put me out there in the world. Now I have 90,000 people following me on YouTube, and there's a community of, I would say, symbolic thinkers. I'm giving them a place to write. Like on my website, I'm putting up a blog. There's communities that kind of get together and talk about this, trying to reinvigorate it in their own communities, wherever it is they come from. And so I've been just nonstop excited about, in a way, sad to see that I think the breakdown of Christianity is is going to continue. Like, I don't have short-term hope for, let's say, the situation, but I do believe that there are seeds which are kind of being planted, and there are people who are getting ready and will bear fruit. So it's been amazing, I have to say. And thanks for that, by the way.
I guess you're welcome, to the degree that I had something to do with it. Yeah.
Used by God. I know some Christians kind of curl and recoil, but I can't get away from it.
I know on Twitter you asked about the virgin birth. I don't know if you wanted, if you still have juice, if you still have energy to talk about that, or
Sure, why not?
Well, the one of the things that is important, I would say, in Christianity is understanding that the role that Mary has to play, let's say, in the same way that we talk about how the reality of Christ.
I thought about skipping the Virgin Mary stuff, not for any reason that should excite Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox debates on her, because actually I learned a tremendous amount from this answer, but I don't know. I'm running out of time, but sure, why not?
Well, the one of the things that is important, I would say, in Christianity is understanding that the role that Mary has to play, let's say, in the same way that we talk about how the reality of Christ had to manifest itself in the world, for us to understand that the possibility of this thing, the possibility of how everything comes together, right? In the same way, for example, in the Old Testament, you have theophanies, you have places where God and humanity meet. So on the mountain of Moses, in the temple, in the Garden of Eden as well. So you have these, they're usually at the top of a mountain or they're at the end of a temple. Okay, so it's still a mountain in that sense.
So that's a place where two worlds meet. That's the narrative world and the objective world, really.
Exactly. So the invisible world and the visible world, the world of logos, the world of pattern, and then the world of possibility, right? They come together, and then that's when the coming together at that point is where you see something. So it's like that for everything.
That's where miracles occur.
Yeah, but not just, miracles are like super events. Like they show us the pattern of reality in a more concise way, but everything is like that, right? So even a chair is a bunch of possibilities, right? That encounters an idea, encounters a purpose, a logos, and then you have a chair. You can't have just a bunch of stuff or else you don't have a chair. You need that to meet. So at the center of everything that exists, there's a little temple, a mini temple, and there's a little incarnation, right? A little, like a mini one. It's not. I don't want it to seem heretical or anything, but there's this little like mini thing that happens. And so that aspect has a lower part, which is the nexus of possibilities, the coming together possibilities, and then this logos which comes down. So this nexus of possibilities, you could call it a mountain, a house, a temple, a body. That's Mary, right? That's her. She's the place of manifestation. So she's the Ark of the Covenant. She's the temple. She's the mountain. She's all of that. And then we play that role. You could say the church, the body of Christ, we play that role. We come together in love, and then the divine logos descends and manifests to unite the body, right, together, and to reveal himself in that unity of the body. So we see Christ in the unity of love. So Christ says they will know you by how you love each other, because that's how you know that a body exists, is that it's coherent. It holds together as a body. And so this body has to be dedicated. It has to be dedicated to the thing which it's manifesting. So like, let's say you have a turkey, a car and 2 bits of grass, and you think, I'm going to make a chair out of that. Well, it's not going to happen. right? It's
I
not
really
going to
didn't
happen.
think you were going to go that route.
But this is it. This is what it's about. It's not going to happen because that's not dedicated. And so, in the same way of a woman and her husband, so a woman has to be dedicated to her husband for the union to be recognized and fruitful. So if a woman is not faithful to her husband, then there's confusion on the identity of the child. Right? But if a woman is dedicated to her husband, which means that she's actually a virgin to all other identities. She's virginal to all other identities, and she's dedicated only to the one thing. So this idea of virginity is super important because it's about dedication. It's about not being mixed or not being
That's uncontamination.
Uncontamination. And so then you can understand that in order for something to manifest the entirety of the whole pattern, right? So it's like, so for someone to be the place of manifestation for the whole thing.
Well, that is what a mother does. Like,
right.
It's what a mother does because she dedicates herself to a greater or lesser degree to bringing someone perfect into being. And the more she loves, the more she dedicates herself to that in every possible way.
You can connect that to Vervaeke's. I should just play that for you because it's really outstanding. And I'm going to play it from, I started a little clips channel called Advander Clips and I've sort of abandoned it, but I want to get back to it. And I put some stuff on from some of my own stuff and a little bit from Jordan and this one from John Vervaeke because I thought it was outstanding.
Capacity for producing Kairos through logos has been identified.
Now, Kairos is important because that's one. So you've got Chronos, which is time this way, and Kairos, which is time this way. And it sort of connects with what Jonathan is saying about dedication and the connecting here.
Use an older term, incarnated in a particular individual. That Jesus of Nazareth is actually the ultimate Kairos. That all the other Kairoses were pointing to him and are summed up in him, that he represents the ultimate turning point. And he represents it not only historically, he represents it personally. Because he is a person, you can identify with him, and that Kairos can come to take place in you personally. Just like Socrates personalizes the axial revolution and brings it into a direct personal confrontation, the encounter with Jesus means that you too can experience a profoundly personal Kairos, which Jesus seems to have spoken about using a metaphor of being born again, about such a radical metanoia, a radical shifting. This is often translated as conversion, until you read about that, right? But this word is much closer to awakening. Noia means noticing. This is your perspectival awareness. And meta means beyond. This means a radical transformation in your salience landscape, a radical transformation of, right, what it's like to be you. It's this deeply perspectival and participatory transformation. And Jesus is saying he incarnates the principle by which you can intervene in your own personal history, or by which maybe you want to say intervention can occur in your own personal history, such that this metanoia, you will have a new mind, a new heart, a new modal existence. You will be born again. What's going on there? What does this Kairos look like? What could possibly so radically transform my salience landscape, my sense of self, my processes of co-identification? What could bring that about? And now I'm going to say the word, and then you're going to laugh because it sounds like a Hallmark card. The Christian answer is love, and now we all titter. Ha 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 ha. That's so quaint. Ha ha. Love. Sounds like, oh, love. Okay. The problem with that, as you've seen many times, is that this word is trivialized for us. We use one word to talk about so many different things, like I love peanut butter cookies. I love Canada. I love Sarah. I love my son. I love a really good, right, game of tennis. Are those the same? We're even confused about this. We think that love is an emotion. No, it's not. Love is a modal way of being. Love isn't a feeling, and it is not an emotion. How do I know this? Because loving someone can be expressed by being sad when they're absent, being happy when they're present, being jealous when there's somebody else around, being angry when they're neglecting you. Love isn't a feeling. It isn't an emotion. It is a modal way of being. It is an agent-arena relationship. And what Jesus seemed to be incarnating as a Kairos to change the history of the world and to offer you to change your own personal history is a different kind of love. This is agape. We have to distinguish between three kinds of love: eros, philia, and agape. See, eros is the love that seeks to be one with something. And that can be spiritual, like being one with nature, or it can be being one with a cookie by eating it. Of course, we come to think of eros erotically, right? Being one with somebody by having sex with them. Right? But remember, Socrates knew ta erotica, which wasn't just sex. Socrates knew what to care about. This is philia. So this is the love that is satisfied through consummation. Philia, this is the love that seeks cooperation. This is the love in which we experience reciprocity. We love the cookie because we can consume it. We love our friends because we are in reciprocity with them. What kind of love is this? And this is what Jesus claimed was how God loved individuals. This is the love that a parent has for a child. This is not the love of consummation. You're not trying to consume the child. That's evil. And it's not friendship. You're not, like, when you bring a child home from the hospital, and I've done this twice, right? That's not your friend. It's not even a person. You can't, it's basically a slug. But here's the astonishing thing. You love it. Not because of any way you can consume it or be one with it. Ew. Ew. You don't love it because, hey, great friendship. You love it, right? You love it because by loving it, you turn a non-person into a person. It's the closest thing to a miracle, and that sounds hackney, I know, but stop back and think about this. You depend on agape. It's because people loved you before you were a person that you have become the person you are. Love turns non-person animals into moral agent persons. It's like somehow if I could just care about, right, my sofa enough, it would turn into a Ferrari or something. It's that powerful. And here's what Jesus was offering. That love can be exacted and made available for all. Here's what is on offer. Here's why Christianity will take the Roman Empire culturally. With agape, Christianity can say to all of the non-persons of the Roman Empire, all the women, all the children, all the non-male citizens, all the sick, all the poor, all the widowed, can take all of those non-persons and say, we will turn you into persons. Persons that belong to the kingdom of God. We'll take another look at this in more detail next time. Thank you very much for your time and attention. God's.
Love that clip.
So now the Virgin Mary is the extreme cosmic version of that, where she has to be perpetual virgin. She is a cosmic virgin. She is perpetually virginal because she's like, you can imagine, like, in order for the sun to...
And I'll have to, I have to confess that when Jonathan laid this out, it's like, oh, that's what they were talking about with respect to the Catholic Church. Oh, well, I can understand that. Now, someone left a comment in my comment section how Jonathan denies the, as we would say in modernity, the historicity or perhaps the physicality of the virgin birth. This happens with Jonathan all the time, and the more I'm learning from Jonathan, the more it's happening to me. But unless you know Jonathan, no, he's not. Because earlier he was just emphasizing the physicality that there's potential and yet this has to happen. And that's what we began talking this particular segment of the commentary about. And so you don't catch Jonathan being skeptical about the virgin birth for materialist reasons at all.
To reflect upon the waters.
And all those men who don't believe that sort of thing should take careful stock of the fact that they're frequently terrified out of their skull whenever they encounter someone they're attracted to. Mm-hmm. They project that or see it instantly, and it demolishes them. And then if they're rejected, they're crushed. And you can think of that as a projection, but you can also think of it as seeing more deeply what's there, and that you only see that when you're actually attracted to someone. And then that attraction has a basis because you're seeing what they could be, even if you're not seeing what's there.
And so that's why the necessity of virgin birth, because she is revealing the highest, right? She's like a still ocean on which the sun is reflecting. And if it was mitigated, then it would only reflect a mitigated manner. And then everything in between is mitigated. Like I said, it's like a woman who's faithful to her husband. Obviously, he's not a virgin in a technical sense. You could say she's a virginal to others. She's untouched by others, but she's dedicated to the one man, just like...
Well, and the degree to which that's entangled with genuine virginity also isn't the case, also isn't so obvious.
Yeah.
It isn't, we don't know what the preconditions are for setting up the ideal relationship. And it's certainly the case that we bring the baggage of our previous relationships into our current relationship. And maybe sometimes that's for the better, and maybe the virginity can be symbolic, but people can certainly be sullied by their past behavior, and sometimes in a way that they can't figure out how to repair.
Yeah. Well, for sure, the Christian ideal has always been the union of virgins, in the sense that then the dedication ends up being tighter. Right. And so you are dedicated to your husband, and your husband is dedicated to you. And then you're unmitigated mentally, even, right? Like in terms of memories and in terms of comparing and in terms of all of these things which we do as human beings. And so it can prevent slippage in terms of your dedication. Yeah. So I don't know if that makes sense in terms of
yes,
understanding why.
These things, grasping these things slips out in and out of my capacity. And I mean, you did a lovely job there of making a symbolic account for the virginity of Mary. I understand that. I understand well.
But no one's going to prove the virginity of Mary historically. I mean, that's something which is not, that obviously is not possible. It's a secret. There's a secret aspect to virginity, which is actually part of its function, and is also part of its, how can I say this? It's part of its mystery, right? Which is something which is not public. It belongs to the identity. It belongs to the, it's like the dedication of something belongs to that which is it's dedicated, right?
We can talk about this to some degree. I mean, imagine that you wanted to form the perfect union with someone. Let's say it's the perfect sexual union for that matter. I think that requires love. Whenever I've had in my life a sexual experience that wasn't associated with love, I didn't feel right about it. My conscience bothered me very much, very rapidly. And maybe that makes me an outlier although I don't think so. I think that is how people react, but they refuse to notice.
Well, and I think here, so you had Vervaeke's eros, I mean, that drives it to us, but what Peterson is saying is that it should be all of the love should come together, should be eros, philia, and agape, and that will be the highest love. And without that, you have missed the mark. And for Peterson, of course, that's the conscience.
Now, I might be wrong about that. Maybe I'm a prude. It's possible, although I don't think so. But it's possible. But it always struck me that sex was best undertaken within the confines of an ultimately committed relationship. That otherwise it was lesser. It was less than it should be. It was sullied. And now, well, I don't have anything more to say about that than that's been my experience. And so, and I don't know what the preconditions are for establishing the perfect marriage, let's say, and the perfect marriage would be one that brought about the best possible children. These are not trivial things. They're very difficult things to get right. Certainly you want the least amount of animosity, unnecessary animosity possible between the parents. You want the union to be tight. You want it to be based on love and commitment. That seems clear even from the psychological literature.
Yeah.
So I have another question for you.
Yeah, go for it.
This idea of theosis. I think it's
interesting how we keep looping back in this conversation. It's, we're going to go back here. Now we're going to go back here. Now back to theosis. And Jordan's sort of, feeling his way through this thing.
It's lack of... I'm tormented by the possibility that it's lack of courage that stops people from bringing into being that union with God. Do you think...
Yes.
You think that possibility there sits there in front of all of us, and it was actually realized once in history?
Well, I think this gets back to the reason for it being physically actualized is in fact, and then the story being given to us is in fact to give us courage. But it's, it's again, I brought in the last video this image of, we have this presumption, this karmic presumption that if we do everything right, then, and then I'll finish that sentence for yourself, then what? Then I'll have lots of money. Then I'll have lots of power. Then I'll have lots of pleasure. You almost hit the book of Ecclesiastes. And the story of Christ says, if you are sinless, this is how the world will treat you. And so you might say, well, then what is the value of being sinless? And that's really where Philippians 2 comes in. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, and again, I think that this union with Christ is part of this theosis that Pageau is talking about. If any comfort from his love, if any sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind, doing nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility value others above yourselves. So in other words, it's this perfection is ultimate humility, and it's agapic. It's valuing others. When the mother agapes the child into humanity with her, when God agapes through Christ agapes us into union with him, this is the path, okay? Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being very nature God did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage, but rather he made himself nothing, by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Read Tom Holland. Read the introduction to Dominion. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth. That's the going all the way down that Jonathan Pageau was talking about. And every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That's the story.
Well, I would say that at least in the tradition of the church, it was perfectly manifested in Christ, but there are other saints that have reached theosis. And that's what we're all called to, that we're all called to become one with God to the extent that that's possible. You know?
Well, then I guess we're stuck with the old problem, which is, if that's the case, then why does the world seem so unredeemed?
Yeah.
That is the hard question. But we are not left with that question without hope. And the reason we have hope, and again, this is Christianity 101, the reason we have hope is because we have someone who went ahead of us. Hebrews 4. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, since as we are, yet he did not sin. Just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. And no one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." One of the most quoted Psalms in the New Testament. And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." During the days of Jesus' life, he offered prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to one who would save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was dedicated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek.
Well, because we're distracted, with reason, where we tend to attend to the lower things. We get distracted by our emotions. We get distracted by all these things around us that are trying to get our attention, and then we aim towards these smaller things. We aim towards whatever it is, right? We aim towards making money. We aim towards getting this or having some prestige. And because the problem is that these things all give us a small sense of satisfaction. And so they're like little idols, I guess you could call them. And so we just aim toward these lower things. And that's one of the reasons why we struggle to see this higher ideal, And so that's one of the reasons why, I guess, what's one of the reasons for church as well is that, it's kind of forces you, even if you're distracted or whatever, to come together at least once a week or whatever, stand together and sing together.
Yes. And to concentrate. I know, I understand that.
Yeah.
No, I remember cynicism that was sort of in the air, I suppose, when the Christianity of my youth started to decompose, when people started to not attend church in droves. The cynical justification in part was, well, those are 1 hour a week Christians. How hypocritical can you get to claim allegiance to this high ideal and then to go back and live your tawdry life? How could anyone participate in anything like that? And what we've replaced it with is never doing it, even for an hour a week, which is actually quite a lot of time compared to none.
Yeah.
So the replacement has not been an improvement by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and then we replace it because we need to come together and we need to commune and we need to celebrate, and so we end up doing it in these kind of secondary places like sports or politics, and all these other places, will replace that. But ultimately, like I said, one of the things that help us to trust, let's say, or to find some respite is that it's together. Like, we're doing this together. And so when you see, there's some comfort in knowing that some people have dedicated their life to God and have lived that way, and it serves as a smaller example, but also as a comfort in those moments. Because usually in the stories of the saints, you'll find times when they're struggling, when they're completely off the rails, when they're not, when they're struggling with thoughts, with passions, with desires.
I mentioned this book sometimes. Reading Mother Teresa by James C. Scott. And I'm not blurbed on a lot of books. I'm not high enough status to be blurbed on a lot of books, but this is the blurb I wrote for him. The high spiritual voltage of a saint is supposed to inspire, but it can simultaneously expose our own insecurities and deficiencies. Through Mother Teresa's secret darkness, James Scott invites us in this lovely book to look at our faith, doubts, and marriage to Jesus. How do shining saints cast shadows and common saints bear light? Read on. A Calvinist looks lovingly at the little bride of Christ. And what James Scott, he's a retired professor of English at Dordt University in Sioux Center, Iowa. What he points to is that this poor woman had so little of what we assume to be the internal necessity of what significant sacrifice and saintliness looks like. I guess I can put it down here so you can see it. And yeah, saints. I guess it goes on the stack here.
Well, you see that in the Old Testament stories. I mean, Abraham is all the patriarchs. I mean, they lived full lives, complete with catastrophic failure and malevolence and murder and genocide and war, and yet were redeemed.
So we might say that Jordan is living a life of biblical proportions.
And so I think that that's one of the things that helps us to like you said, to see. It's like you don't have to, obviously you don't look at the person who goes to church once a year or whatever. That person has their own thing to deal with. You find and you see these people that are the opposite, that really live. And everybody has met, I would say, probably a few people like that. At least I've met a few that are just, I've met some priests, monk priests that are glowing, like they're just glowing. And you see it in their eyes that they live at a level of peace and acceptance that I don't have access to. And so it's like that type of encounter is also part of your transformation, because it tells you like, oh yeah, I see it in your eyes. Like I can see that this exists. It's not just something we talk about.
I want to talk a little bit about heaven. So I talked to Matt Ridley a while back and Bjorn Lomborg, and I'm interested in their thinking because they're trying to plot an optimistic course for the future, one where at the highest levels of social integration, we decide how human society should look, at least insofar as we conceptualize how it might look if we addressed some of the major problems that beset us. But it's an attempt, and it's an attempt to make things better. It's an attempt to bring about something increasingly resembling heaven on earth. I mean, heaven is generally conceptualized. You can conceptualize it as a state of being. It might be the state of being that those people that you described live in. I've had paradisal experiences where everything transformed itself into something that was perfect, that appeared perfect. And I was unable to stay in those frames of mind.
Now I want to bring something in here, again, because it's become a theme in this, where I think there's real value, and Jordan does it particularly well in terms of understanding, let's call it the symbolic resonance of heaven and earth in this dispensation. And Pageau isn't gonna use my phrase that when you try to bring down heaven, you always bring up hell. And there's definitely truth in that symbolic resonance that we see here. But again, one of the things that I don't hear a lot of people mention, especially you won't hear it in a prosperity gospel church, is the reality that if you manage to live like Jesus, you will get the reaction that he got. That is something worth seriously thinking about, because the assertion is often, and it's sold this way. A little bit earlier, Jordan was talking about selling. It's sold this way. Well, and I watched the Seeker Church do this, if you come into this church, we will make your life better. And that's often the case. We will offer, it's very interesting how in the Vervaeke corner, we're talking about wisdom. And actually Sam and John start talking about wisdom there. But the assumption is always that wisdom will make your life better. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, you mean, more money is better than less money, and finer clothes are better than poorer clothes, and better food is better than lesser clothes. And so that in biblical cadence is very real, and it's very Old Testamentalish in many ways. And then the New Testament comes around and says, in some ways, the life of Christ and the New Testament is an extrapolation on the book of Job, because the book of Job looks karma square in the face and says, that's not all there is. And Christ's life basically deconstructs karma, because my name is Earl. Watch that old sitcom. Do good things happen. Do bad things happen. That's true, but it's not the whole story, and the book of Job brings that out. And so then you get to this question of, we want heaven, and so what the Seeker Church did a generation before we talked about this meaning crisis was the Seeker Church, preachers like Bill Hybels and Rick Warren and the Seeker pastors, they would preach almost all the time from Proverbs, and they would turn sermons into wisdom, which was very interesting because it was a difference from earlier fundamentalism that would turn sermons into altar calls in order to save your soul. And so you actually see the development of these layers. And so the Seeker Church comes along, and basically what they offer Americans is they say, hey, you've been chasing all of this well-being. You're doing it in, if you believe Eric Weinstein, you're doing it in the most affluent time and the most affluent places. I mean, the northern suburbs of Chicago, Lake Forest, Southern California, Orange County. And they're saying even your great wealth and success and security that is unprecedented on the scale of the world hasn't yet fulfilled you. Let me offer you more wisdom, and wisdom in terms of managing your money better, wisdom in terms of doing better in your marriage, wisdom in terms of learning to manage the appetites which are within you, which actually more affluence won't curb, because your prosperity is in many ways a product of having some curbs at least on those appetites. So those Seeker churches preached wisdom. And it worked in that these churches grew very large. Then, of course, the emergent church, the emergent movement came after. called them evangelifish. And then the emergence church sort of split between justicey churches and then the young, restless, and reformed churches, or be grungy for Jesus churches in some cases. So that's sort of where that went. So this question of heaven is, again, Jordan, I think, does a good job in articulating the symbolic resonance of heaven and hell in this dispensation, but that gets tricky in this dispensation here now.
The heaven, is that something we build? Is that something, I don't understand the relationship between the heaven that awaits us, let's say, after we die. That's the idea, and what we build here on earth. Do those touch? Is that the doctrine? There's so much of
and this also gets into, see, part of the problem with Jordan's book came out today. There's 2 or 3 other videos that came out now about Jordan in this video. So suddenly, I've got 2.5 years of nothing, and suddenly I've got a glut. And over the last 2.5 years, I've been building all sorts of other projects, and I don't want them to just go out the window while Jordan sort of rushes to the top of the salience hierarchy. But this entire, when you look at the woke questions and Christian nationalism and all of these things that are currently in the news, you have to understand the history of Protestantism and Christianity in America, where, I had that conversation about the founding of New Haven, Connecticut as the city of God. And the Puritans did this. And so, after the Civil War, you had this post-millennialism that was you had post-millennialism, and then you had the rise of millenarian movements that were imagining that we have nearly built the kingdom of God, and it's about the millennium is about to happen. But then, of course, you had the inversion with the premillennialists and the dispensationalists. And all of that is a big part of the story that leads then into the rise at the peak at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the crash in the First World War, the split of this evangelical unity between the fundamentalist and the modernist. And this question that Jordan is asking right now is really at the center of it.
this doctrine I don't understand at all.
I think a way to see it has to do with attention again, and it has to do with a hierarchy of attention. If you try to build heaven, you're going to fail. You're going to fail miserably because you're not aiming high enough, right? You're aiming, and then you get stuck in this.
You cannot build it in the age of decay. This is fundamentally what the resurrection is about. Read 1 Corinthians 15.
These weird world of opposites that you don't
and Romans 8
even understand the side effects of what you're doing, you know. And so for one person, heaven will look like if everything could be perfectly ordered, then, right? And then we know what that looks like. And another person will look at heaven and think if everything could be free, if we could all just be free, and then that we know what that looks like. And so the idea is to look higher. There's a story that I've been
we have to strive for something better, but then we end up in, which is what you're saying, is that we end up with the Tower of Babel, or we end up with the flood, or we end up with the continual catastrophe of unintended consequences. But as you yourself said, we are aiming for something better. And so the question is, how do you pursue utopia while avoiding the pitfalls?
Well, I go back to Acts 1. After the crucifixion, after the resurrection, right before the ascension, Acts 1, the disciples say, "Now will you restore the kingdom to Israel?" And Jesus says, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses. The job in this dispensation is to bear witness.
And that's a theological question.
And the witness isn't merely success. And that's where this gets confusing, because the witness is cruciform and it's success. It's both of those things come together.
And I would
it is.
say,
And I think I know this, people are going to hate that I say this, but it has to do with worship. It has to do with what you worship. So if you worship those things that you're aiming towards, the lower things, if you worship the making a safer society, if you worship the making a freer society, if you worship making a stronger society, all of these things are going to go off the rails because they have unintended consequences that you don't understand.
Well, I would say it differently, that you want a freer society, you want a safer society, you want all of these things. And as Pageau and Peterson say, they were formed in a hierarchy. And also, as Peterson said, way back in the first biblical series, you need something at the top of the hierarchy. That's what Pageau is saying. You need something at the top of the hierarchy that is actually not here in play. And that's why God has to be at the top of the hierarchy. He is the frame of frames. He is the system of systems. It's the only thing at the top of the hierarchy that can, in fact, include the whole, which is why and this is about what Jonathan is about to say.
Because they're a fragment of reality. You know, they need to be encompassed together in order to reach something higher. And so
that's the danger of ideology. It's the part takes the place of the whole.
So the idea is that if you worship God, then those other things will kind of lay themselves out slowly, and you won't be able to force them. They'll kind of lay themselves out slowly, and they'll start to manifest, progressively, and but you have to attend to the highest, or else, like I said, and there's an image of Antichrist which is related to this problem. In Scripture, one of the first Antichrists you could say was Judas, who betrayed Christ. Well, there's a story with Judas which is very fascinating, because Christ doesn't talk to Judas very often. But one of the places where Christ talks to Judas is when a woman comes in and wants to anoint and wash Christ's feet with a very expensive perfume. Yep. And then Judas says, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this? Why don't we give this to the poor, right? And Christ says, the poor will always be with you, but the bridegroom, Christ, the Messiah, is there for a short time. And
yes, so that's the other kind of story. It's very difficult to understand how anyone could have invented that story. Like, it's not the story of propagandists.
No.
In fact, it's the opposite.
Yeah. But that story has to do with attention. So Christ obviously isn't saying you shouldn't help the poor. Christ has said to help the poor. He said it many times. You have to help the poor, give to the poor, of course. But he's saying get your hierarchy in order.
And you'll help the poor more effectively that way
right.
than any other. That's the case. That is the case.
So it's like it starts with worship, and the acts that she's doing. If you look at what she's doing, first of all, she bought something expensive. She's sacrificing it. She's sacrificing it to bow down and to wash the feet, to submit, to sacrifice to, and to worship. So those three things. Like when I talk about the aim, how you end up having to submit to that aim. And so this is so Christ is saying. First comes worship, then the world lays itself out below that in an appropriate way. And that's what the Sermon on the Mount says too. Yeah, and those that are saying help the poor as their ultimate goal, in Scripture it says that Judas didn't even want to help the poor. He wanted to take the money for himself, really. Like he was a thief actually, and he was taking the money out of the purse. And so those that just want to reduce.
Well, I suppose the truth of the matter is that
There's this great story on this documentary that Byrne pointed me to, where you had Malcolm X in the U.S. Well, he had Mike X in the U.K., and he became this radical revolutionary, and he was doing all of this stuff. But eventually he just became a thief. And actually, in some ways, everybody sort of has a story that they believe Judas was. That, to me, is sort of the story of Judas, that Jesus is going to clean out the Romans, and Jesus is going to bring justice, and Jesus is going to do what's right and eliminate the contamination. And then if Judas is actually paying closer attention than Peter and many others, he will figure out that Jesus is not going to clean out the Antonia fortress and clear the Romans out of Jerusalem and have Herod strung up in the streets and bring in exactly what Judas is looking for. So, the money.
genuineness of your desire to help the poor is precisely proportional to the degree that you embody Christ.
And if your aim is helping the poor, if that is your aim itself, you're going to look down on the poor. But what you do when you help the poor is that you actually instantiate, through dedication, all this virginal stuff, you instantiate Christ, who does what? He gives out. It's this self-donation. It's this agape. And it's the, if you treat the poor with agape rather than just, oh, you lack money, here's money. But if you treat the poor with agape, you invoke this saving power that transforms, and you avoid some of the things that happens in attempts to help the poor, donor resentment, all kinds of, and I've seen all my life all kinds of the ways that this just doesn't work. It has to be agapic.
That's right.
And it can't be otherwise. It cannot be otherwise. I see that. I see that clearly. Because otherwise things will go astray.
So that's one of the problems with the modern projects of utopia, is that they're Babelesque in their attempts. And you can see like the type of gestures that the world authorities are posing in terms of safety, extreme, like, with COVID and everything, this desire to create absolute safety, this desire to create absolute identification and tracing, and all of these kind of weird gestures that show that they think they can control reality it's leading us towards a very dangerous place.
Well, one of the things I noticed, I did some work on a committee at one point that was advising the UN in relationship to the establishment of its millennial goals, and there was hundreds of goals, not rank ordered. And so it was a Tower of Babel. Because you can't have hundreds of goals that aren't rank ordered and have any goals at all. Because to have a goal means a hierarchy. Something has to be more important than something else. And there isn't anything more important than getting your act together, so to speak. Yeah. And, well, I'm going to have to think about all this a lot.
We're not going to have to wait another 3 years, are we, Jordan?
Yeah. But there's the question that keeps lurking in the back of my mind, which is, does the fact that that's how it should be mean that that's the way that it is?
Or maybe the should be is what we're anticipating. And we again, Lewis and his argument in Mere Christianity, we're built for another world, which sounds frustrating, but if you imagine there is one who can conquer death, then it's also hopeful, because I've been to the mountaintop. We're going to get to the promised land.
And that's trust. That's a question of trust.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a question of trust which ends up manifesting itself in love, and I think that like the love that you have for the world, which is clear. Anyways, it shows me that you might be closer to that trust than you might want to admit to yourself, maybe.
Well, I don't know what to do with it, I suppose, is the real problem, especially in my current circumstances.
Oh, it does with you. You're the one that says people don't have ideas, ideas have people. It sounds like the most powerful idea in the world, which is agapic love, you're in its crosshairs.
Yeah.
I'm the most confused person I've ever met. I would say.
Yeah.
You're not the most confused person I've ever met. Far from it.
And I've met some pretty confused people, so.
I wonder if I could match. I don't know. I've known a lot of confused people.
Well, thank you. That was really something.
Yeah, it's a really a joy to talk to you, Jordan. And like I said, there are thousands of people who are praying for you, and
well, they're keeping me alive.
And your story isn't over yet.
So much the pity for me.
No. Well, I'm going to pray. I never pray in my monologues, but I want to pray for Jordan. I want to pray for Jonathan. Lord, you are the story maker. And few of us have seen a story like Jordan's. Lord, you know all things. And we believe that history isn't random. But you are, in fact, as Sam Harris said, as a tractor beam pulling us into the future. And so I ask, Lord, that you be with Jordan. I pray, Lord, that you give him relief from his pain, or you make his pain productive. Lord, you do amazing things in this world, and you surprise us in big and little ways. And part of why I love talking to all these randos is that there's so much surprise in so many stories, and there's so many good ones. So I pray, Lord, that you would be with Jordan, that you would help him see that you are not ideas that he is trying to come to terms with. That's a frame confusion. I ask, Lord, that you would continue to move through his life, which you clearly have been doing, and that you move in his heart, and that you give him some of what he's seeking, whether that be insight or relief from his pain or rest for his soul. Bless his family that he so dearly loves. Be with Jonathan as well, and continue to use Jonathan and bless him and watch over him. And hear my prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen. There's a reason I don't pray in monologues. I know it makes people uncomfortable, but there, I went through the whole thing. Now I can have a clean conscience, and I can start chewing on these little really highlight moments and come to terms with them. So if you've gotten all the way to the end of this video, thanks for watching.